Good evening, everyone. I'm Claire O'Dowd, Research Curator at the Henry Moore Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's discussion, which is part of a series of events on the theme of fabrication. And we've developed this series in collaboration with Pandea Sculptors Centre. We began the series back in April, and it's going to run till the end of this month. And over the last few months, we've been discussing this theme with artists and fabricators in order to reveal some of the practical aspects of how sculpture is made, which seems to be one of the art world's best kept secrets. And we've discussed fabrication as a career, looking at how people move between the two roles of fabricator and artist. We've explored various technologies and the ways that artists use them. And we've heard from a lot of different artists about how they develop relationships and collaborations with fabricators. If you've missed any of the events in this series, you can catch up with them on the Henry Moore Institute's website, on Pandea Sculptors Centre's website, and on our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on fabrication and sustainability, which is a hugely important concern for everyone who is involved with the production, commissioning, or display of sculpture. And it's a subject that's going to become only more important and pressing over time. But before we go any further, a reminder of our usual Zoom housekeeping. We're recording tonight's event. It's going to be made available on the Henry Moore Institute YouTube channel, as well as on the Institute's website and Pandea Sculptors Centre website. If you need subtitles, or if you have them and you don't want them, the subtitles can be turned on or off by clicking the closed caption button on the bottom toolbar, which is the one with the CC symbol on it. If at any point your video freezes or you're having connection issues, we recommend restarting Zoom. You can rejoin using the same link and we'll let you back in again. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts and questions throughout tonight's event. So please do feel absolutely free to join in. And questions and comments can be submitted using the chat function, which you can find on the bottom toolbar. If you want to mention your name, please include it in the message, otherwise we'll keep you anonymous. But to begin with this evening, I'm going to hand over to Lucy Tomlins, who will be co-chairing the discussion tonight, so that she can tell us a bit more about Pandea and their work before we introduce tonight's guests.
Thanks, Claire. For those of you that don't know our work, Pandea was founded in 2013 and facilitates the production of innovative new sculpture and develops critical cultural and educational programming around contemporary sculptural practice. We offer a mix of services, including art consultancy, technical and fabrication, and we collaborate with artists, galleries, and cultural institutions, among others. All proceeds from these activities are reinvested into our non-profit initiatives to support practitioners and promote and enrich wider public engagement with this art form. Pandea is artist and female-led and committed to addressing structural inequalities and to a more diverse and equitable art ecology. Breaking down barriers of entry to the field is an important part of this work. And one of the ways we try to do this is by public knowledge sharing and revealing what goes on behind the scenes to make the art world, or art worlds, function. For this reason, we're delighted to have collaborated on this season of fabrication talks with the Henry Moore Institute and to be sharing insights into how sculpture, installation, three-dimensional art, art made from matter, art that takes up physical space and that is made from real stuff is created, and by whom. Tonight's talk is going to leave no question in its demonstration of the level of skill, ingenuity, and talent required to realise the world's leading artworks. So we're delighted to have with us this evening Petra Schmidt, Production Manager for Commissions at Tate Modern, and Ivan Clarke and Matt Ridsdale, Directors at Millimetre, the team behind the production of Cara Walker's epic 2019 Hyundai Turbine Hall Commission at Tate Modern, Fons Americanus, to share their experience with us this evening. But even more than that, at a time when the world is in the throes of a climate emergency, we will ask and hope to answer the question of how artists, fabricators, and cultural organisations can and should be considering sustainability and playing their part in reducing the impact of their activities on our planet. I'd like to welcome our speakers this evening, and before I hand over to them to begin their presentation, I'll give you a brief intro into each of them. Ivan Clarke has a mixed background, initially studying for an ecology degree and then an environmental philosophy master's. He then ran a recycling charity before moving towards a more vocational career, studying furniture crafts, welding and CAD, going on to establish his own sculptural lighting business. From there, Ivan spent time at Brighton Hove City Council, working in regeneration, community and environmental arts programmes, prior to moving to Millimetre, where he has been a director for the past 13 years. Matt Ridsdale studied three-dimensional design and craft at West Surrey College of Art and Design, now University of the Creative Arts. Sustainability through design, a module first taught in 1993, helped to define Matt's sensibilities and his approach to design and material use. Since then, Matt has worked as a designer and maker, working on projects varying in scale from furniture and lighting up to modular buildings, large-scale public sculptures. Before co-founding Millimetre in 2006, Matt was a partner in a product design company, a sole trader, designer maker, and then a co-founder of an organic cafe and gallery in East London. His role at Millimetre often involves problem solving, fabrication strategies, and material specification. He particularly enjoys working on long-term public pieces, those that have inherent human value and are not wasteful or fleeting, works that people will inhabit and enjoy. And finally, Petra Schmidt is a London-based creative producer, currently the production manager for commissions at Tate Modern. She primarily oversees the delivery of large artworks created for Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, including those by Cara Walker and Annika Yee, due to open this autumn. Before that, she worked on public art installations for the London Design Festival and in various operational roles at the Crafts Council, British Council, and at the Design Museum. Welcome, everybody. I'd now like to hand over to you guys to tell us a bit more about your work on Fons Americanus before we open up into questions. And I believe you've got a film to start with. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So if we go straight into the film, then we can get a feel for what it took. Okay.
Shall I make a start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can start, Petra.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. It's really nice to see the film. I miss having the fountain in the turbine hall. It's a little while back that we worked on this project, so it's really nice to be reminded of what a great collaboration that was. So we thought to make a start, I could maybe talk a little bit about the commissioning process here at Tate Modern. So under normal circumstances, the way this would work is that our curators, as well as senior management, can suggest an artist who they think has sort of a significance, and where the Turbine Hall Commission, for one, is not too intimidating, but also maybe offers for them a possibility to come to some sort of conclusion in their work, or maybe to realize something that they haven't worked on before, or certainly at a scale that they maybe haven't worked on before. So once all of these proposals have come in, an individual will be selected and contacted. So we don't really have a brief for turbine hall commissions. We like to keep things very open. But what there is a description of what the project is, and of course of the turbine hall and all of these sort of the framework of the project. And the artist has the opportunity to either accept or decline. I'm not really aware of any artist declining in the past. I do know that someone has pulled out at some point because the task at hand seemed all that daunting. But otherwise, as far as I'm aware, artists were very welcoming and very happy to participate. And once that initial contact was established, then the team, so the team that I'm usually a part of, will be introduced to the artist. So I work on the production side of things, which means on the technical development of projects, all the way from concept through to production, installation, de-installation. But I also work with a curator or senior curator, and an assistant curator, as well as an exhibitions assistant. So we have a core team of 4 individuals who are supporting the artist. And we very much feel like we are part of the team. So we don't want to be the institution, and we don't want the artist to feel like they're working for us. But much rather it's a development that we all work on together. So the artist will then, with our support, develop a concept. So we quite like people to come over and actually have a look at the turbine hall, because it is a space that really can't be captured in images or in film. We have tried it before and it didn't really work. It just doesn't really, the scale doesn't ever come across naturally. So in an ideal scenario, the artist comes around, we have a walk through everything, we talk them through different elements that are important for the work. And from there on, we work with the artist on developing a concept, which then in turn is submitted to us for acceptance or not. Again, I think because it is such a close collaboration, the way it will work is that we receive a concept and we have feedback that is often our management, but then also various different stakeholders across the gallery. So that may be visitor experience, that may be health and safety. So really thinking of the whole journey of how visitors encounter the project in future. Because the turbine hall is an incredibly exposed space, and it works very differently to gallery spaces where there's always this distance between the artwork and the viewer. Whereas in the turbine hall, there is a real emphasis on audience interacting with the piece. So with Cara Walker's Fons Americanus, for instance, people were invited to sit around the fountain and really contemplate and take in everything that was built into the work. So then at that stage, we would be bringing in a fabricator. Thankfully, we don't have to go through a tender process because this is actually the fabrication of an artwork. So then, yeah, in this instance, we decided to work with millimetre. and Cara Walker was very much involved with the decision making. And the way we like to make that choice is by seeing a prototype. So because often we start with a very basic drawing. In Cara's case, that was a drawing and a collage. She also had small clay models that she wanted interpreted. But really, we wouldn't really know how that looks on a larger scale. So it is quite important for us to understand the materiality. So yeah, that's essentially the process and the sort of whole duration of it. We like to work with about 18 months. It turns out that less is too short and more tends to be just kind of, we lose the momentum. So 18 months has shown to be a good amount of time. Maybe Ivan and Matt feel a little bit differently about it and would like to have more time. But yeah, on our side, that feels quite good.
Petra, how did Cara react when she first saw the turbine hall?
That's a really good question. So I think for Cara, as well as for many other artists, it feels it's a very daunting space. It also doesn't have the most ideal proportions because it is just a very long tunnel and it is very tall. So whereas Cara has worked on a large-scale sculpture before, the Sugar Baby, it was still at a slightly smaller scale potentially, and it was just less intricate. So she, like many other artists, I think the immediate reaction is wanting to fill the space.
Yeah.
And how that often ends up is just a bit too much. It's just kind of like, it gets quite crowded at times. The ambition sits very, very high to start with. And often I find, and we find that by reducing the original ambition, it actually works better in the space. But yeah, it's all inspiring. It really is. I don't know if you ever had the chance to come around and see us. But yeah, it's an interesting space to work in.
Definitely. I think artists seem to have different reactions to the space and also different kind of approaches to it in terms of whether they try to kind of dominate the space or try and do something that works more with the space rather than sort of fighting it. This one was a really interesting approach. And for you as project manager, when do you become involved with the process?
There is a bit of a conversation around that, really. So as things have panned out in the last years, I come in as early as concept development. So as soon as the artist is introduced, I will come in and support them through concept development together with the curator and the assistant curator. There is some benefit to me coming in later because when I bring in all of the framework, all of the do's and don'ts in the turbine hall, that can almost limit the creativity. So whereas I'm involved through the concept stage now, I really stand back and only give very crucial information because I don't really want artists to be, to hold back or to feel like they can't go as far as they possibly want to. Because there are certain regulations that they have to adhere to. So I much rather bring in everything else later on. There are certainly some things that are helpful in the development of a concept, like visitor routes and how people navigate through the building, how they interact with the piece. So all of that can be helpful, and I'm giving that to the artist if they're asking for it, definitely. But many things will come in later and will become more important later on, like health and safety and all of that. So, yeah.
And what about the process of kind of picking fabricators? How did you end up with Millimetre? How did Ivan and Matt get involved in this one?
So Millimetre and Ivan and Matt and I have worked together in the past. So I knew of them. And we have kind of supplier lists at the Tate, but nevertheless, I always like to work with new people. I always like to go out and see if there is somebody who has great skills. So I did go out and met with a few different fabricators. At the time also, I should say, we had to go through tender. So the development that we don't anymore is a fairly new one. And so I met up with a few different individuals, and we had a couple of people, so Millimetre and another fabricator, produce prototypes. So we could better assess how they received Cara's original idea and how they would interpret it. So that was really important. How do they visualize it? But also what was equally important is how they collaborate, how they work with the artist and us. As I said, it is a very, very close working relationship that we have. So some fabricators are very much used to taking on a project, building it, delivering it for a client, for somebody who is slightly removed from the business. But in our situation, we really want to be involved, and the artist wants to be involved. Cara wanted to be involved. So the fact that Millimetre are very strong in terms of collaboration, working together. That was a big, kind of ticked our boxes very much. And I remember we had a presentation in one of the side rooms of the Turbine Hall where Matt and Ivan presented the first prototype to us. And I remember vividly leaving the room and having a conversation with the team, and they didn't know at the time, but for us, it was a decision made then and there because we absolutely loved what we saw. So, yeah.
And Ivan and Matt, can you talk us through some of the production processes that went into this?
Yeah, of course. Did you want to do it via slides, or should we? I guess we could start by suggesting our approach wasn't necessarily the straightforward approach. So a bit later we can kind of come to this, but Cara's the scale of the work and the definition that was required, it lends itself to large-scale sculpting, which would traditionally be in potentially polystyrene, effectively. We knew this from the beginning, that would be other people's approach, potentially, and that we also knew at that point that we wouldn't be interested in that approach. We don't have the facilities or the interest in that material.
We're not really set builders, and that kind of approach is a set building approach. We are more fabricators for long-term items.
And so that sort of defined our approach, really. So we went away and thought about how to manufacture this, how to produce that level of detail and that the scale that was being proposed. It's quite daunting, and we had to come up with a system, which one of the first ideas that came to me, and it's not necessarily original. There are other pieces that have been produced in it since, in fact, just before there was a building produced in black cork, and it got me thinking: could we do this in possibly the ultimate, sustainable material? Admittedly, it's all from Portugal and southern Spain, but it's effectively carbon neutral or negative, and it can be carved. So that was the premise, really. We attacked big blocks of cork and some large blocks of timber as well, some lime. At first, we didn't think the cork would necessarily hold the detail. So we looked at using a lime or a tulip wood as well, maybe for the faces, the hands, of the characters, and and set about making the prototype. As Petra said, it was really well received. We could kind of tell it was well received in the first meeting, but we didn't know we'd won at that point, won the pitch. But yeah,
even at that stage, it was still quite experimental. There's one thing producing a head as a kind of sample, and another thing turning that into a 5-metre sculpture. And even though we did the prototypes, I think until Cara came in and got her hand into it and sort of communicated that hand to our, the sculptors and all of our staff, I think a lot of the detail would have been missed. So again, the works were built from 3D scans of Cara's work. So she sort of designed it on a hand-sized scale. That was 3D scanned. We took those models and cleaned them up, and that started to inform the process. So taking the models, we were using an unusual bit of software and then flitting in between that and architectural, because we needed to take something that was almost animation into something sort of machine capable. So we moved that way.
So this slide is of a section. I'm not quite sure which wave it is. Effectively, wave and shark. There were numerous components of this nature, and although they look quite small here, they're actually quite large. So we, as Ivan said, we were using a piece of software called Freeform Plus, which is a kind of haptic feedback sculpting software, and we were generating from scan data mostly, and from Cara's team. They produced models in Rhino, I believe, and then we manipulated those so we could soften them, kind of re-sculpt them, and maneuver them around, kind of reshape them, and then look at dividing them for production. And that then relied on the machine capabilities we were using. So some of this, so this one's good in that it shows you we 3-axis cut the cork, which came in sheets, and laminated those sheets together. You'll see that in a bit.
It kind of gave us a topography, which you'll see in the next couple of slides, but that was the starting point.
We used cork dowels to join them, so minimising the amount of glue required. We had to research the glue. Cork doesn't glue very well, very easily. You can't use low impact glues, PVA, for instance. So moving on, this is the shell grotto from one angle, and you can see how many components it's made of. Each colour is a separate cork block.
So for production, we had to think about machine capabilities and then how we put it together.
So that probably worth saying that the robot that we used can machine up to approximately 2 meters cubed, but other machines have a lower capacity, especially the 5-axis machines. So we had to divide each component up for production. Most of it was produced in-house, and some went elsewhere and came back to us.
Which comes to the timescales. So, we had a lot to produce in a relatively short time, and we had to organise that. Logistics we'll come to in a while, but on a piece of this scale, the logistics are a really central part. It's one thing producing it, you've got to actually put it together and move it. So should we move to the next slide?
This is an example of the model and then the cork stacking. And you can see the forms required, and that each block was then machined with an offset detail. We knew we were going to render it. We were experimenting with various renders. So each model is offset, effectively shrunk to then grow when we added the mortar.
Okay, should we move to the next one?
Okay, that's the captain's legs. You can kind of see the stacking. This one shows the inner supporting structure.
Coming to logistics again. So in terms of production and logistics, these are, being 5 or 6 meters tall. The cork isn't rigid, even with a render over the top. So we had to think about ways of enabling it to have some stability, but also we've got to lift these and move them. We've got to move them out of our workshop. We've got to load them onto trucks. We've got to be able to get them off at the other end. They've got to hang in a certain way. So we do an analysis of how is it going to move in the air? And then we've got to, once we've even got it into space, we've then got to find another machine to lift it and put it into place. So there's a lot to do with the way things move, their stability and their transportability.
And to add to that, to the resilience effectively of the pieces. So try to reduce the amount of cracking when lifting, hence the steel. We tried to minimise the use of steel. It is at the absolute minimum in each of the cases.
In terms of sustainability, we've got cork in there, we've got steel that could be removed. So I think we'll come to it a bit later, but one of the parts is thinking about the afterlife of this. So should we look at the next slide?
This is a waterline study. So as well as the sort of the obvious construction potential issues that we were navigating, we were also looking at the ponds and the form of the ponds, how deep the water level should be, and how pieces look within that. Also, the longevity of the piece. So how to seal each piece effectively, each character, so that you can't see the sealants.
This comes to the slightly left off, but the health and safety involved that Petra starts to mention. You've got to think about the depth of the pools in this instance. Mm-hmm. Treatment of pools, and then it varied what Cara's initial ambition was. She was really incredibly good at understanding some of the complexities and the impositions of things like health and safety, and so she worked with us to make sure that her work still held its authenticity but functioned within the kind of parameters that the Tate Petra health and safety starts to put on these works.
The fact that the piece had a bench on its outer edge was actually a consequence of us wanting to keep visitors away from the water. Equally, the depth of the pools was a result of health and safety regulations. So we were trying from very early on in the design phase to integrate those health and safety aspects so that we don't have to, so that doesn't become an afterthought and we have to put tensor barriers around the piece or anything like that. So yeah, the bench is very much, you can imagine a spacer between the piece and the audience.
One of the critical parts of production was a design risk assessment. So rather than the normal kind of risk assessment, how are we going to lift this safely? Is anyone going to be in the way? Do I need to wear a high vis? It was much more around everything from aesthetics, so the risk of different types of materials and how they'd impact the aesthetics. There were some health and safety things, so how do you treat the water? There was, a lot of things like that. And even in the design risk assessment, things like, well, how do we get this into the space? Because the turbine hall, like other places we work, like the V&A, actually have very small doors to get through. And it's proved entertaining over the years, yeah. But that was a really critical part, I don't know if you'd agree, Petra, of making sure that things functioned even before we'd really got to the full-on making. We thought about a lot of items and involved various stakeholders throughout the Tate, from visitor to health and safety to people providing electricity, those kinds of things. Okay.
So the previous image was a render that we sent through. So this is the kind of level of renders we were producing. Initially taking their scans, their models, and then working them up in the software, adding detail, smoothing, and really for Cara to say, and her team just to say, is this what you're looking for, and then to respond. So this is before we got into the actual physical sculpting.
And Cara wasn't with us all of the time, so if you look at the two different heads, you'll see that the one on the right, there's a lot more detail in the beard, and they have eyes. The one on the left doesn't have eye holes. So we were trying to work out the style that Cara would want, and this is part of the collaboration process, trying to understand the aesthetic that she required.
And level of detail achievable.
Okay. I think to explain this maybe better to everyone here, what happens if you have a small sculpture, a handmade one? Someone explained this to me at some point in the project, and I thought that was a really good visualization. When you have a fingerprint on that, it will just, when you blow it up, it will just become this huge blob. So essentially, then sculptors have to go back in and add the detail. So I remember during production, when we went to see the progress at first, the sculptures actually had a very different aesthetic to them. They're very soft, a bit like the Michelin man. And with Cara's input, she really added a lot of grit and sharpness and edges to everything. And I remember vividly her partner, Ari, is a photographer. So he took these very good images of all of her original sculptures, which were about sort of 30 centimeters, relatively small, and millimetre sculptors, who are all sculptors and artists in their own right. They then had something to work off, whereas previously with just the scans, it gave a wrong impression of what that was supposed to be.
Yeah, when blown up to the size.
When blown up to the size.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to move on to the next slide?
Cool.
So this is where we kind of move from the sculpture into the construction. Millimetre, we work in construction as well as arts. But you begin to see the detail. All of those pieces there are pieces of timber. And whether that's CNC'd cut plywood for some of the horizontal ribs, but the pools were all built in softwood. And again, when it comes to sustainability, we're thinking about, well, what are we going to build this in? We designed it in a way that we could take it apart and reuse it. There's a huge amount of timber there. Thankfully, it is now in a place, hopefully we'll see it again. But it had been designed for recycling, taking apart, and this shows the kind of detail we had to think about.
Can I just jump in and ask at that point then? The kind of sustainability approach, where did that kind of come from? Was it from Cara? Was it from Tate? What was the kind of impetus? Because I can imagine that it's definitely, certainly not going to be the cheapest, easiest kind of a option.
It's definitely not the cheapest option. And I think the Tate drove it to some extent, and we've always tried to do that. I mean, I can't say we're, wholly successful, but we try and bring it in. And then once it was there, one of the reasons that we were selected is because we had found a product that we could justifiably say that, we can reuse it and the offcuts can be used. A lot of the offcuts were taken and you went to a compost place. Some went to be used for explosions on films, But you know, we had that basis, and we then tried to work through all the way through. Even the resins, you know, they're by no means sustainable, but they're less harmful. And I think, in truth, that's the way to look at it. Sustainability would be you couldn't say something like this is sustainable, but it is less harmful than alternative options. And then we carried on working through, like I say, the resins were bio resins. They have a higher content of plant-based. They're still not perfect, but you have to go with what's available.
Also, sorry, Petra, I was just going to say we engineered the piece to, and I think Petra would probably agree, to feel differently to a poly sculpture, for instance. So the products we used are far more solid, and the final result with the render over it's quite solid. It feels the render has a very stone-like texture and feel. It has crushed stone in it, and when you feel the pieces, you touch them, and sort of even knock into them, they feel incredibly solid. There's no kind of booming. There's no flex. It doesn't look like there's plastic involved, effectively.
Yeah, so Tate has been following, an agenda to become more sustainable for a few years now, and has announced the climate emergency and the contribution of the gallery in 2019. This project was very much in line with this, although it actually started before that. So it became an example of how things can be done. But this really kind of hit the sweet spot between being, a wonderful experience for the visitor, different to what a performance set would be like, because people have to touch it. They have to believe what they see. They have to believe that this is a sculpture that was made from stone or clay. But then also, I think, it also fulfilled a lot of other criteria in terms of the team that we were working with, because we don't really want to have anybody work with very toxic substances that are threatening or dangerous to their health long term. And equally, we are thinking more and more about what is actually coming into the gallery. So much rather than exclusively thinking about how do we recycle things afterwards, it's also about which materials do we use. And thankfully, we did have the budget in order to look at materials that are more expensive, but so much better to work with.
On the subject of materials, we've just had a question come in which relates to this actually, and the question is, what was the render, and was that part of the sustainability ideal?
The render is actually one of the Jesmonite products, and I think we'd be lying to say that it was one of the sustainability ideals. However, it's relatively thin, and we did some experiments to see whether we could remove it from the cork at the end of the life cycle. So there's always going to be waste. That's why I said we have to think of this as less harmful. So we checked that we could get it apart, and then we could extract the cork, so the cork could be reused, ground down, whatever. But the Jesmonite would never. It's not perfect. It's a stone-based and acrylic render. Yeah.
And some of this came down to the drying times and the sculptability as well. So we did look at other render possibilities, but the drying times were incredibly long, and in the time scale we had, they really weren't very viable. So that was one of the drivers really. In the image you saw of the stacks of cork, you also you could also see a water filter. So it's not complete. That's in the process of being built. So we looked at the whole system of fabrication. So we ended up using a lot of water. Jesmonite uses a lot of water. And any wastewater was effectively, we had a tank. Any solids would sit in the tank, and then any water would be filtered off and go through a multi-stage filter. So we were looking at all aspects of this, trying not to discharge it or discharge as little as possible, and waste as little as possible.
So the water that came off, the wastewater, was safe by the time it had been through some almost like household filters, and that's how we took out the particulate out of it. So yeah, again, not perfect. It's just trying to do your best as you go along and think of it slightly more holistically.
The amounts were quite astounding. The amounts of jesmonite, the tonnage of jesmonite, and yeah. You can see some of the cork being cut for lamination and it being sort of compounded with the plywood. Okay. And there is some of it being set. So these are the kind of machinable blocks, if you like. They're all indexed so that they fit on the robot.
Yeah, organisation of components, making sure everything is indexed, everything aligns, you know, in the design. And then once you've machined one bit, making sure it goes together and people can actually know which bit goes with the other bit. And it sounds quite simplistic, but when you've got, you know, 1,000 different pieces, and there is an enormous jigsaw, you have to index and clearly label. So all the drawings are set out so we know, you know, what bit goes with what. And when it comes to the installation, there was a few slides back where we showed the plinth. We actually used sort of CNC templates so that we could drop one piece onto the structure and know that it was the correct orientation, because it will only fit in one orientation. You need to try and make it as simple as possible as you go along.
And that's Queen Vicky's head becoming, well, rising out of the block. There was a lot of machine time. Roughing first in a very particular way so the cork didn't blow, and then sort of adjusting the feed rates as the detail got finer and finer.
Okay.
There she is.
It's quite a scary thing, the robot. It's a bit sci-fi for my liking.
It's about 5 meters tall, just for scale there. So they're quite large blocks. And you can see the detail from the roughing. That's the captain made in parts being put together. The last piece going on. And that's you can kind of see the first layers of the jesmonite. And this is one of the tree in its first sort of putting together. And this illustrates a technique whereby we can get to all sides of the components. It's kind of a bit air fix. We leave sprues on the components, mill them out as far as we can go. Go too far and they start to chatter within the block. So it's just a question of leaving just the right amount of material and then hand cutting them out, removing them from the blocks.
Okay, I see there's a question about the jesmonite. Yeah, the jesmonite has a degree of flex. We used in the same way that you use for fiberglass a matting behind it, because it helped enable the jesmonite to bind to something. It's actually really designed as a casting product, so to render it was to use it in a different way to the usual. Yeah, we used that. It gave it strength. It gave it some flexibility. Yeah, that's part of our experimentation, really.
It kind of reduced the likelihood of it cracking substantially.
The matting is glass fiber, isn't it?
Mineral fibre, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not Hessian, it's not necessarily a natural degradable material.
No, the problem with Hessian is the direction in which the fabric moves. So we needed a multi-directional fabric, and it was a special weave to enable that to happen. Otherwise, you can't push it into some of the details you want to. You need to be able to get it to sort of stretch and move as you push it into the details.
Again, we tried lots of different fibres and weave configurations to come up with the best product, effectively. Yeah, and this is almost complete, complete with tear ducts, later reduced in length.
When did Cara get involved actually in the studio then, and how long was she, you know, around and working with you? How did that process go?
So Cara joined for a couple of weeks. We were quite far along into the making until she came to the UK. We had already produced the captain. So as I said earlier, the aesthetics were very different. So when she arrived, that was a good moment for her to make those tweaks already and to give it a better direction, or a direction that is more in line with her style. But it was already into production, certainly. But we did have weekly phone calls with her. So the update was always there. But because she's New York based, it just, you know, it's a logistical effort to get her to Brighton. She stayed in Brighton at the time as well. So yeah.
Yeah, because I noticed, you know, she's definitely, well, from this image and from the video as well, she's clearly hands-on working on the sculptures herself. I mean, maybe can you talk a bit more about that? And also, I guess, different artists must have a different approach in terms of how they work with you as a kind of fabricators.
Yeah, definitely different artists have different approach. So what was great about Cara is she's very, very personable. We got her to work with one of the other sculptors so she could begin to understand the material, because she hadn't actually used the render. And then she developed the style and got the techniques. We used things like carving knives and all sorts of stuff just to get the finish. And everyone then worked with her and shared that style, which is what enabled it to be communicated across the rest of the work. So I think we said earlier, you know, the product that comes from the cork and just a straight render is fairly rounded and soft. And it was her input that actually really translated it across the whole work then. So, yeah, that's really important. Other artists, I mean, we've worked with quite a lot of artists, people like, you know, Grayson Perry we worked with. Grayson was very relaxed. We literally had some sketches. We carved work and made casts for him. But if you think about, I was thinking about his artwork before. His style is quite relaxed in a way. He's quite easy, isn't he, comfortable with what he does, and not so precise, or at least that's how it translates. So he was easy, and yeah, other artists. Some artists are very, very particular. It just varies from person to person. I must say that of all the people we've worked with, we've never had anyone who's been really, really precious. I think we come to it from a perspective that you know, we want to create what the artist is looking to create. That's our goal, and so we're always going to try and achieve that. It's not we're not telling them what to do. We're saying, well, okay, this is what you want. Well, does this fit? Can we make it? How, you know, we'll work with you.
Great.
So I noticed that someone's come in. There's a couple of questions. I'm afraid I've missed the one before, but research that goes into the material innovations.
That's one of our questions here as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you want us to move on to that? Are you happy for that? Yeah, there's a lot of research and experimentation and a leap of faith. And I think, you know, we really appreciated the Tate on this front because it wasn't a standard technique. We hadn't actually developed it that far when we set out. We knew it could be done. We'd got far enough to get reasonable samples. Like Matt said, we were going down the line with wood for some of the details. So it is a leap of faith. Some projects we get a lot more time to experiment with finishes, surfaces, and so on. This we had to jump in and then complete in sort of 6 months. I don't know whether that answers. Have you got any more on that?
I could expand a little bit, but essentially the material did what we wanted it to do, more or less. You know, it's kind of full of branches and big chunks of bark. It's, you know, and it was discussed with the producers of the product, and it's the way they harvest the cork. It's effectively the lower grade corks that go into the steamed expanded blocks. It's kind of an industrial use, really. Sometimes used for insulation, quite often used for placing heavy machinery. It's kind of a sound absorbent, shock absorbent material. It can be carved, and it has been carved, but probably not on to this detail and on this scale. So in a way, it behaved really well. It exceeded our expectations. We expected to be gluing a lot more parts, or, you know, trying to join a lot more parts together after they kind of exploded. It was actually pretty good. So those experiments and speed of cut and type of cutter, you know, we went through a lot of different choices to come back with something that worked reliably.
The same applies to the jasmonite, doesn't it? The jasmonite is usually a casting material. Mm-hmm. So you did your experiments applying it on the surface.
Yes, and submerging it and impacting it.
Actually, I thought I'll bring a little souvenir. I've got this.
So
that stayed in water for weeks and weeks, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. So this was a sample in order to see if the jasmonite will crack and how it will behave if it's underwater.
Isn't cork absorbent? I mean, doesn't...
No, well, strangely, only to about 70 millimetres.
Oh, okay.
In total sort of thing. It's actually quite resistant past that point.
I'd forgotten about leaving the piece. We did all sorts of things like that. We left that in water for ages. With the bioresins, we created sort of mini ponds and left water in to see how they'd respond. You know, we were just trying to make sure that it didn't go wrong when we got into the Tate. But
I guess
go on, Petra.
Well, I guess we also expected you to do these tests because, as you said earlier, it was a leap of faith. And at the time where we agreed to go ahead with this direction, we had only really seen half of the captain's face, actually a quarter of it. Mm-hmm. And that was done on wood rather than cork. There was the cork idea around, but I think we just needed a bit more reassurance down the line that these experiments, even when they were on a small scale, actually did work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, just going back to the general research, I mean, you can probably see our background is quite a lot of books, but the rest of the room here is absolutely full of samples and test pieces, because everything, you know, whatever we make, we're testing the finishes, whether it's strong enough. We're doing some more stuff at the moment with cork for a client, and it's going to be public realm. So they want to do simple things like, can you stab a key into the finish? You know, we do all sorts of things like that.
You can.
You have to think quite broadly about the actual use and the interaction. And the public do all sorts of strange things. So it's quite important to do that.
I was just going to show you quickly. There's not cork related, but some sort of steam bending, some big chunky oak steam bending. So we get asked to do lots of or work with lots of different processes, and we set up and sort of do our best with each process effectively. The team are really quite flexible and knowledgeable, so they like a challenge as much as we do, I think. So I should say a little about this image. It looks a little like Sophie's fallen over here. So there was the nature of the pieces. They're quite connected and quite large. So sometimes you had to work in some sort of strange situations. This being one of them.
We just like this image.
She survived.
Yeah. Okay, is that the last image, or we a few more?
We've got some, I think, more of the sort of you can see how full the workshops become.
What is quite interesting in this image, actually, if I just can mention this, you see the captain's flat back. So the captain was on one of the first tier sculptures. So it was sat on what we ended up calling the quatrefoil. I don't even know if that's a real architectural term, but
works.
It works. So it was sat against a wall, meaning that we were actually able to save quite a lot of material on that. But obviously there is a risk about water ingress, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's true. Actually, even when we got to site, we didn't quite know where the water would go, so we had to have thought of ways of preventing water ingress into all sorts of places. We just came prepared, or as prepared as we could do.
The maintenance of this piece was incredible. So we had a maintenance manual and all of that, and we had bi-monthly visits by the company who installed the fountain system. And it was all running really smoothly, but with COVID and everything that happened, we really went through different phases of having to switch it off, having to switch it back on. And really it's a material that really changes. So when we switched it off the first time, and we drained the water, it started cracking along the edges. So Millimetre then had to come back and to redo some work on it, especially around the resined areas. And yeah, water did penetrate the structure at some point. We should probably say that this was the very first time either of us ever did a fountain, unless you have done one before. I certainly haven't. So it didn't exactly strike us to start with that obviously you cannot have any flat surfaces anywhere. So if anybody ever wants to build a fountain, lesson number one, don't have any flat surfaces because water will stand on there, and after a few months of running it, it will go through the material.
Well, also we didn't know quite where the jets of the water would go. So whilst we forecast certain things and sealed certain places, it was still open to the laws of physics, I suppose, and there were bits that splashed and so on, and we had to kind of adapt to it as we went along. We learned and we changed things. Jesmonite was quite forgiving. We found ways to make everything work. But Petra did touch on something there. So maintenance of artworks is a really, really critical part. And I've worked in public art, doing things that are in the public realm, and commissioners don't put money aside to maintain them. It's a real problem. This had a very detailed maintenance manual. I know because I sat and wrote it. Everything was explained in it, but it often isn't the case. And then people come back to a sculpture or a piece of public art or something, and they don't know anything about it. There's been no maintenance. And then you have people dealing with councils, for example, getting someone in that just doesn't know anything about it. It's quite important that those things get built in.
So just looking at the previous slide was a test build, previous to. So we felt that we needed to lift the elements up to test them in the air, to check that we could control their movements and that they would be secured to the various components. So this happened quite quickly, and I think it was fairly surprising to the neighbours. It just sort of started towering above the houses. No one had any idea what it was.
The test builds are something that we now try and build, depending on the scale of the work. But actually, if you can do a lot of practice off-site, then that aids the install massively. And some sites, we've done some work in Trafalgar Square, and you get a very small window. So whatever you're doing has got to be right. You can't just turn up and hope for the best. So these kind of things were a really useful part of the process.
There are two questions which we haven't answered yet. Shall we do that? There's one, did we need to seal the jasmonite for water exposure? Yes.
Yes, we did. And again, we chose a sealer that was as least toxic as possible. And yeah, some where we didn't have to use it, we didn't, and where we had to use quite a few coats, we did.
Was that the bioresin or was that something else?
No, the bioresin was great actually, but it had a different look. So that where you could get away with using it and not seeing it, that was great. Where you could see it, the pieces in detail, for instance, the sort of swimmer, etc. You saw the various water levels. We had to seal very well underneath and over the top of the jasmonite also. And it was, a water-based sealer. The name escapes me. I won't go into that much detail, but it was, lots of testing again, many brands and lots of testing.
And then
the question is, sorry, the other question that's, I don't know how you're best to answer this, but is how much of the budget would you recommend putting aside for maintenance? And without going into the kind of in-depth financial,
I think
like a percentage or
no, I don't think a percentage is an easy way to do it, because it depends on the piece of work. So we knew, taking this piece as an example, we knew that the water in the fountain needed to be checked every couple of weeks, and we needed to get the correct pH, and we needed to make sure that, the biocide was at the correct level, because it's the Tate, you think it would be clean, it's inside, but it's, dust is full of human skin, and you've got all sorts of things and creatures living, so you've got to make sure that the water remains safe. But coming back to maintenance, so we had to think about that. And then we had to sort of guess about, what happens if someone chips something? What happens if something cracks? So Cara and I worked out roughly what it would cost for a visit for our team to come when the Tate closed to work for 6 hours or something, and then go back to Brighton.
So just to be clear on that note, the budget sits with Tate, and actually the fabrication budget is only a part of the larger budget. And it depends really very much on the project as well. So on a build project like this one, obviously the majority of the budget will go into fabrication. But there are different examples, for example, the one I'm currently working on, where the division of budget is slightly different. So I don't think this question can be answered exactly in terms of how much of the budget would you set aside. But there is a requirement to calculate an estimate. And when I put budgets together for projects, I work with estimates as much as I can in the beginning, so that I can understand how we sit within the overall. So we work with set numbers, there isn't very much flexibility because it's a sponsored project, and there's a certain amount that we receive, and within that we have to work. So if it comes to maintenance, the maintenance almost, it needs to be enough for the project to run, but it also needs to work within the wider project budget that is allocated. So yeah, I don't think that's easily answered, unfortunately.
Yeah, in my sort of experience of broader kind of public art, it varies massively. So if you've got a bronze sculpture, your maintenance is likely to be minimal. You might need to allow for some graffiti being removed, and or you might, other things, if it's a paint finish, that every year it needs to be checked. It depends where it is. So yeah, it varies massively between the work, from one work to another.
Higher for kinetic artworks.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the important thing is to remind commissioners that they need to be thinking about this from the outset and building this into their budgets, and not, not thinking that the job is done once something's installed.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
It's good to hear how, when it's done right, how it's factored in.
So we should also say on this occasion that actually the Fons Americanus was in place for much longer than we had originally anticipated, which then obviously very much increases the cost that goes into maintenance and repairs. So most of the Turbine Hall commissions are in place for 6 months, sometimes less. And this was in for, I would say, probably a year. It came out in January, didn't it?
Was it January?
I think January 2020. 21. So probably nearly a year and a half. So almost 3 times that, but obviously with closures due to COVID. So you can deduct a few months of that. But yeah, significantly longer than any other Turbine Hall commission before it, which is also credit to the great quality of manufacture, that the piece was actually still in really good condition after all of that time. And we had it cleaned at times, as I said, repaired here and there. We had some water ingress which needed fixing. At some point, the grotto, so the fountain was one of the 2 pieces, but there was a smaller one, which was the shell grotto that Matt showed at the very start of the presentation in one of the drawings. And that gave us a huge headache at some point. We just couldn't figure out where the water was disappearing to. So yeah, it just a gift that kept on giving.
Can we talk a little bit about the kind of afterlife of the sculpture and what happened to it afterwards, and also what its legacies are in terms of your practices, all 3 of you, and how you now think about sustainability? What happened after the exhibition closed?
What do we
Can
say,
I take
Petra?
that one?
You do this from an official
I take that one. So we deinstalled it with the possibility for it to be reinstalled. The Tate does not own the piece. We don't own any of the Turbine Hall commissions, purely because I don't know if it's purely, but also because we don't have storage space at that scale. So it exists in a place, and we shall see what will happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it. It's 13 Arctic truckloads. So, I know it's a bit of a jump, but it's something that I'd written down about sustainability. We find it a real challenge, and one thing that for me is quite important is whether the benefit that the sculpture or the piece of work achieves. So obviously this Cara's piece had a fantastic sort of social message. You have to ask yourself whether the benefit it achieves is greater than the harm done by the materials used in making it. And I think that's quite important evaluating sustainability, because sustainability is ecological, but it's also social as well. It's a very broad subject like ecology. It's how everything is interlinked. And I felt that was quite an important thing to think of on this particular work.
And
That's a really, really good point, that this project doesn't have a kind of material legacy. It has quite a huge impact beyond that. But what about the legacy for you, as in terms of your practice as fabricators, and in terms of for Tate as well, in terms of moving forward?
For us, we did actually hope to be using these techniques again, and then we got COVID, so a lot of work went on hold at that point. So yeah, I mean we are producing a piece using similar techniques. It's in sort of the initial stages. I think Ivan mentioned it earlier, and it's very much in the public realm. It's public. It's definitely not an artwork. It's kind of sculptural, but not art. More furniture, large scale. So that's kind of interesting. Very similar techniques using the same base material. The robot is being utilised again. It works really well in softer materials and up to hardwood, but won't touch anything harder. So that's being utilised. It's had a break. It's quite a lazy robot, and yeah, so that's great. But it's just started again for us.
I think on our practice, you know, I'd like to say sustainability is high up on our list, and it is. I often have the kind of, you know, I think I put in my bio cognitive dissonance, you know, where I'm challenged between trying to make something beautiful, trying to make it in a material that's functional. The public realm's a good example. So you might want something that's sustainable, but again, you've got to think of the longevity. So, you know, we've had timber is quite an interesting one at the moment. Historically, people would have used tropical hardwoods, and actually they're perfect for the public realm because they last for a long time, and you use a softwood and you're going to replace it quickly. People are developing new materials. You know, we're using a lot of Accoya at the moment and Kebony, which are both softwoods that are treated. Kebony is treated with a byproduct, I think, of sugar produce. You know, so there are materials coming on, but demand. So this is a really important part of the sustainability. If we can create a demand by getting it specified, then obviously demand creates supply. And so, you know, you can start to afford things because eco alternatives are expensive. And that's one of the great barriers to getting stuff specified. Mm-hmm. You can, I've got a note here about one instance I've used, we had a client that wanted us to use tropical hardwoods, and I didn't want to. So I just referred them to their own environmental policy, you know, and then, you know, there are ways to make things happen.
Did that go well?
It did, yeah. Oh. It was fine, but it could have been badly received. But you know, equally, you know, as I say, we're not perfect, so it's a process. You've got to think of this as moving towards and being less harmful.
Yeah. I think an important aspect of this, also from an institutional perspective, is to get people to understand that just because there are sustainable or natural materials behind it, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it needs to look like it. I think we've realized with this project very much that, you know, there's cork in it, and but it can still exactly represent the artist's idea. So I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. I guess in the past, projects that would have used reclaimed or recycled materials would very much look like it as well. And that's completely a branch, and that's completely fine to do, of course. But in some aspects, I think design, architecture, art, the artist's concept may not necessarily want that or allow that. but you could still think of how to cleverly use materials that are less toxic, friendlier to the environment, and still very much represent and achieve the idea that the artist envisages. So that's a big learning for us, I think, for me personally.
Do you think that there is more of this happening now? Do you think that these methods and materials are beginning to take off?
So I've had a few conversations to suggest that this is happening, and that other industries that you maybe wouldn't imagine are changing. So the film industry, for instance, uses a huge amount of polystyrene, and there is a movement within, and I've had a few discussions and given a lecture on it to kind of quite a large audience, and that there's a real desire to move towards more sustainable materials. Quite often a set will just be disposed of. So if it can be dismantled, separated, composted, ideally, or reused, even better, then great. So I think there is a movement. It is more expensive to use these materials at the moment. As Ivan said, that cork is used widely, so it's one of the easier to get hold of, sort of carvable materials. But other materials will come along and replace the more damaging products.
I agree with Matt that there's an effort taking place, but I think for the foreseeable future, and we had a conversation about this internally, we will be.
Oh no!
She's got us in the cliff there. I don't know whether she'll come back. I've had mixed experiences. So I'm working on a project at the moment that is supposedly net carbon zero, but in truth,
we were talking about this earlier as well, I guess, that more sustainable does.
Petra's in mid-flow, I think.
Okay.
So I'll pick up the point saying we're working on something that's net carbon zero. It clearly, in truth, isn't, and it can be argued in some ways, but actually what seems to be more important is the aesthetic over the environmental credentials. And I find that slightly worrying that it's being used like that. But there is some, you can push back, and we all can make choices. It is difficult when you've got a family to feed, and I'm sure that's true for everyone out there, making those ethical choices. We want to see beautiful things in the world. I'm challenged.
I think we kind of can't make the perfect the enemy of the good in some ways. Like
No.
Have to keep moving forward with it.
It is on the agenda, though, whereas it might not have been on the agenda 10 years ago. So it is happening.
That is really good to hear. We have a couple more questions. Let's try and answer this one. Was this project all consuming, or did staff and studio at Millimetre have capacity to work on other projects?
Yeah. So we did have capacity to work on other projects, and we continued with other projects. So Ivan can tell you more, but effectively the robot did quite a lot of work. So that was kind of enabling in a big way, and we're lucky here. We have we can draw upon a lot of artistic experience in this area. And we built a team effectively. Some of our regulars to sort of to anchor the project, and then also some freelance staff.
So we're we're normally set up for joinery metalwork, and obviously this was a slightly different project. So we've got a much wider family and network. And so for this particular project, although there's a lot of timber work and a lot of those kind of expertise, we were able to use a good portion of our normal team, but still keep a good portion of our team for other projects. So we produced quite a large scale bronze installation as well, at the same time a bronze cast installation. But it's partly because we went out and found the skills that we needed for this project, which was slightly different to usual. And being in Brighton and this kind of area, there's a lot of people, so we're very lucky. And who wouldn't want to work on a project like this? So yeah. It wasn't a hard sell. So it's not like I'm asking someone to spend 1,000 hours sanding, bits of wood. It was a bit easier, and it was an amazing team across the board, from the Tate all through our team. And I think that enthusiasm shows all the way through. And like I said, the Tate were part of the team, right down to something that is a small thing but very important. We actually got acknowledged for doing what we did, and all the team did. And the Tate were amazing, and Cara was amazing like that, because quite often you produce things and whoever it is, the artist or the architect, gets the credit. So that was amazing on this project.
What is quite incredible is often how small the teams are, and what an incredibly large project that small team manages to pull together. Someone said this the other day in a call, we are a lean machine here at Tate. So we sound like a huge institution, but behind the scenes, we are literally a tiny little team. So yeah.
Well, I think we are just about out of time now. I'm really glad you made it back, Petra.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is Tate's fantastic Wi-Fi. Happens all the time. I'm sorry.
Well, we're glad you made it back in again. So we're going to
come back to one question. There's a question relating to my career path. So not that we have time to do that, but if whoever posed it, if they want to contact us, I'll answer that.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, we need to say goodnight now. We've hit 7:30 and our time is up. But I want to say a huge thank you to Ivan and Matthew from Millimetre, to Petra, and to Lucy Tomlins from Pandea as well, for not only for this event but also for helping us throughout this research season. Pandea have been fantastic collaborators and have helped make this season a massive success. Our next event is going to be the final event of the season, and I have to tell you about it before we go. It's a 2-day conference in collaboration with the universities of York, Sheffield and Leeds. It's going to take place on the 27th and 28th of July, and it will explore fabrication between 1660 and 1860, so looking at historical classifications of making and materials and how these might affect the way that we understand and value sculpture today. And you can find more information and book tickets for that through the website. And I hope that you'll join us for the closing conference. But in the meantime, this evening, thank you so much to our amazing guests. It was fascinating to find out more about the processes behind this. And I sincerely hope inspiring for a lot of people in terms of ways of moving forward and thinking more carefully about sustainability in large-scale sculpture projects. So thank you to Ivan Clarke, Matthew Ridsdale, Petra Schmidt and Lucy Tomlins, and a very good night to you all.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.